Alex. Lovely. Good evening, everybody. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight for this discussion of Kathleen Jennings' Flyaway. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I'm currently broadcasting to you from, the Yagara and Turrbal people. I pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Before we begin tonight, I'd just like to reiterate a little bit of the information that I sent to you in the email with the link to tonight's event. So you've all automatically been placed on mute, and you'll remain so until the end of the event when I take you off to join me in thanking our speakers. But we will still be having a Q&A session. Kathleen is keen to answer your questions. And in order to do so, we'll be using the chat box facility. So if you can't see it, it should be towards the lower left hand of your screen. If you click on that, then you can type a question in, which will come directly to me, and I'll read them out along with your name when I'm prompted to do so later in the evening. So please start sending those through to me as soon as you think of them. So the other thing I'd just like to mention is that we have a special promotion on this evening, and that is for everybody in attendance tonight for the next 24 hours, you can receive 10% off your orders made site-wide if you use the code EVENT at checkout. Now, I'll be posting the link to purchase your copy of Flyaway in that chat box that I was just telling you about. So I recommend that you get in nice and early and make the most of that 10% off. So before I hand you over to Fiona and Kathleen for our conversation, I'd first like to introduce Garth Nix, who'll be saying a few words before the conversation begins. So Garth is a New York Times bestselling author and has been a full-time writer since 2001, but has also worked as a literary agent, marketing consultant, book editor, book publicist, book sales representative, bookseller, and as a part-time soldier in the Australian Army. He is the author of numerous works that have been translated into 42 languages, and more than 6 million copies of his books have been sold around the world. So Garth, I'd now love to hand over to you.
Thank you very much. It's great to be present, at least digitally, all around Australia. I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional owners of the land where I'm broadcasting from, and pay my respects to elders past and present and future. I was delighted to get a copy of Flyaway very early from Ellen Datlow in America. Once I overcame my feelings of immense jealousy, because I've known Kathleen's work through her art for quite a long time, and I love her artwork, and I've always been tremendously impressed by it, and have even had Kathleen commissioned Kathleen to do some artwork for me as well. So when I became aware that she was a writer as well as being an artist, I did have to repress those feelings of, gosh, can she do everything? And apparently she can. She's musical as well, which is yet something else to be jealous of. So Ellen said, would you like to read Kathleen's short novel Flyaway? And of course I said yes, and I was delighted to receive it quite early in the piece. And then I started to read it, and I loved it from the beginning, but it also brought back to me lots of childhood memories, because I have about 1 million relatives in Queensland, in bush Queensland, in the country, on cattle farms and cane stations. And every winter holidays, we were driven to Queensland by my parents and visited places that were miles and miles back then, kilometres and kilometres away from everywhere else. And some of it was fascinating, some of it was exciting, but there were quite a few places where I felt this strange existential dread. And I wasn't sure there was the people, the landscape, what was going on there. And Flyaway brought all of that back to me. And one of the things that I really admire about this book is how Kathleen has managed to capture the landscape of the Queensland outback, but also infused it with European myth and legend that we've brought with us, and make them, into this compelling tale, which has had a tremendous reaction all around the world, from all kinds of figures. Publishers Weekly said, in spellbinding lyrical prose, Jennings lulls readers into this rich, dreamlike world. Kelly Link, one of the greatest short story writers of our era, says Jennings' prose dazzles and her magic feels real enough that you might even prick your finger on it. And that's true. It feels so real, all of it. The bush, the mythic structures there, that incipient sense of dread that's lurking, which I love, and I'm sure many, many other people do too. So Flyaway, it's a wonderfully written book. It's a fascinating read. It evokes all kinds of emotions, both dark and light. And it's also a beautiful book, of course, because Kathleen illustrated the cover, and there's wonderful chapter opening art as well. It has French flaps. It's all, the whole package is very, very beautiful. So I feel very privileged to be allowed to introduce this tonight. And I'm really looking forward to hearing Kathleen and Fiona talking about the book. And I'm sorry we're not all there to raise a glass together to fly away. As a poor substitute, I have a little bottle which I will pop. And it's a very unimpressive bottle. But here's to Flyaway and to Kathleen. Congratulations, and may Flyaway fly away from all the shelves. Congratulations, Kathleen.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Garth. So I'd now like to introduce Kathleen Jennings. Kathleen is a 3-time World Fantasy and 1-time Hugo shortlisted illustrator and Ditmar award-winning writer based in Brisbane, Australia. Flyaway is Kathleen's debut novel. And in conversation with Kathleen tonight, we have Fiona Stager, owner of Avid Reader and Where the Wild Things Are. So Fiona and Kathleen, I'll now hand over to next conversation.
Lovely. Thank you so much. Thank you, Emma Kate, and thank you, Garth, for that wonderful introduction. I was so honoured and thrilled that Kathleen asked me to do this in conversation. Kathleen joined our events team a little while ago, and she was a pleasure to work with, and I've been following her career for a while now. So I was so honoured to be able to do this. So we're talking about Flyaway. Flyaway is a novel that's kind of set in country Queensland, and maybe Kathleen doesn't know this, but I grew up in a small country town in Queensland, and as Garth said, I understand the existential crisis of those towns very well. But to introduce Flyaway to you all, it starts, our main characters are Bettina Scott, who's a young woman. She lives a tidy, quiet life in Runagate, tending to her delicate mother and their well-kept garden after her father and brothers disappear. Until a note arrives that sends Bettina and 2 of her friends into the scrublands and beyond, searching for answers about what really happened in this town and to her family. So Kathleen, congratulations on a wonderful novel. I thought it might be nice if you could start by reading a little bit, just to give the audience a sense of how beautiful this book is.
Thank you, and I will, but I wanted to say very quickly, I'm really honoured that you're able to do this in conversation and that Garth was able to introduce it, so thank you. I'm going to read a little bit from the beginning of the book, from the very first section, just describing the land between the 3 remote towns where the story happens. That triangle tangle of roads and tracks held the district of Inglewell. Hills and scrub glittered in the powder white light, fading to chalk blue. Sharp grasses fluttered pale in the paddocks, green and burgundy on the verge. Grey huts subsided into themselves like memory. Then the plunge into purple shadows, the troll rattle of an old timber bridge, a secret of dim emerald, and the barrier shriek of cicadas, then up again, sky tumbled, grass fogged. It was a fragile beauty, too easy to bleach with dust and history, to dehydrate with heat, bleed with the retort of a shotgun or the strike of a bull bar, or blind with sun on metal. Easy to turn from it, disgusted and afraid. But if you got out of a car to stretch your legs and instead were still, if you crouched down and waited, it would find you, nosing among the grass like the breeze. The light and loveliness would get into your bones, into your veins. It would beat in your blood like drumming under the ground. Memory bled and frayed there, where ghosts stood silent by fence posts. There the bone horse kept pace with night drivers while high branches shifted continuously, even on breathless days, and creaked with the passage of megarities or other creatures unseen, and at midday long shadows whispered under the trees. And what trees? Bottle and box, paper and iron, thorned and blossomed, under the unutterable light, the sky blue as breath, as enamel, or beaten like copper, everything beneath it turned to metal or else translucent. Trees like lanterns, like candles, ghosts and bones. The fibrous skeletons of moth-slain cactus and beetle-eaten lantern bush leaned over the opal-veined bulk of petrified limbs spilled in empty creek beds. Trees bled rosin like rubies, sprouted goitrous nests, suspended cat's cradles of spiderwebs, spinning discs of silk. Trees stood hard as bronze in still sunlight and stirred like a living hide in the rolling advent of a storm. If you were born to Inglewell with all its fragile propriety, its tidy civilization, its ring fence of roads and paddocks, wires and blood, there was nothing else in the world beyond but trees.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So my first question is, how did the place you grow up influence the setting of your story?
Very much so. I do want to stress, first of all, it's not specifically set where I grew up, but the invented district of Inglewell is very heavily influenced by that area. I didn't actually grow up in the small town. We had a cattle property. But a big thing for me was growing up with the sorts of Australian children's books that we had at the time, which was a lot of Colin Tierley and Gary Crew and Ash Wednesday bushfire books. I was seeing a lot of aspects of Australia which did not reflect the landscape that I knew, and this very particular brilliant beauty that was there, not desert, not, there was just this ephemeral loveliness. And so it certainly influenced it in that way. And also I did have a pattern in my head of a lot of the locations, of the sorts of pebbles on the road, of particular bridges in mind. My mother told me today that she's been reading through it, marking up in pencil the bits that remind her of specific places or things that happened. So it certainly had a very specific visual impact.
Did you always want to set it in Australia and in that kind of environment? Did you ever think about it being somewhere that was more untangible?
Not so much with these stories, because I do definitely write and set stories in places that are more intangible, invented worlds. All of the ideas and images and things I wanted to play with that came together for this story were very much set in Western Queensland. There's another story I wrote that's kind of sort of related to this, which just got reprinted on tour.com, which I wrote first. And it originally started as being set at the beach, and I couldn't get it working until I moved it further and further inland. So it made it almost a Toowoomba. But all of these stories definitely belonged to that landscape, and that particular glittering light.
And the other thing that I know about you is that you've been, you're a former lawyer, and I'm just really curious about how that career path influenced the writing of this story.
Oh, that's a good question, because it does influence my writing. I don't think I was conscious. I wasn't going, I'm going to write Flyaway using legal aspects, but certainly all the ideas of boundaries and borders and roads are something that really came into focus for me as something that I love in fantasy when I started working as a lawyer. Because when I finally got to contract law, and particularly property law, which is the main area I worked in as a lawyer, there was this moment of, oh, this all makes sense now. Everything else was theoretical, but adjustments and leases and rights of way and easements, all of that are the words of people influencing the world and our lives. So both the sense of borders and an affection for a certain sort of plot and a certain sort of power in books, which is the power of words over other people and over the world, definitely came through in Flyaway.
Because one of the characters, I think it's the Damson family, they are fence builders. And
Yeah.
I just thought that was a really interesting metaphor for so much. And I wondered whether that reflected on your career.
It didn't come specifically out of it, but we've known a lot of people who do fencing and so forth. But I ended up working in-house in one of the pipeline companies just for a little bit, seconded there, and there was this constant discussion of boundaries and fences and how close to the pipeline you can go and what terrible things the fence has done, and oh no, they were burying their lunch in the post holes, and it was such a beautifully human yet archetypal job that was happening. So that certainly came through when I was working on Flyaway. That again, a sort of affection for that part of life.
And because I also know you've got a great love and academic interest in fairy tales, and so where did this come from? Where did this love and deep interest in fairy tales come from?
Well, when I was little, my father used to read out loud while my mother did the dishes, and then he used to read Little Red Riding Hood all the time, until one day where he could take it no longer and refused to read Little Red Riding Hood and leveled up into other books. And my mother said he didn't put enough expression in it, and she took over and he had to do the dishes from then on. But I still remember the particular Little Red Riding Hood book, and there's a way that the fairy tales combined with the landscape that I was seeing. I've always loved books, I've loved fantasy, but fairy tales are really so thin on details. As an artist, I love the visuals of the books, of the images and that texture. But as stories, you could act them out anywhere, you could play with them anywhere. And so they very quickly became a lens through which I interpreted the bush as much as the other way around. And it wasn't until a couple of years ago that I finally started to get to go to places where certain fairy tales came from and realize the influence that the landscape had. If you get to the Black Forest after reading a lot of grim fairy tales, and you're like, it all makes sense now. Or you go to England and you go to a town where a particular folk tale happened, and you're like, oh no, it's not just a story that happened long ago and far away. It's a story that happened in a particular year in this town and has now entered this mythic realm. And getting to have all that experience, go to Iceland, which doesn't have 50,000 years of human history and story on it, which only starts in 800 AD, having any human history at all. And to feel what that feels like, the absence of story in a landscape, and then come home again. And then just because of the accumulating familiarity with fairy tales, I find them very useful to use as a template for academic analysis, as a way to decide how many chimneys to put on a roof in a picture when I'm putting an illustration together for someone else, which isn't a matter of fairy tale retelling. It's just, I think I've internalized them to the point now where they're much easier to remember the structure of a particular fairy tale than, a 3-act structure or a 5-act structure of the hero's journey.
And so what are some of the fairy tales that particularly influence Flyaway?
So accepting that I am using fairy tale very broadly, as anything that I personally feel has fairy tale weight, quite a few. There's the story of the 7 ravens is one that I come back to frequently, and it's not the first story that has been influenced by that. Blodworth from the Mabinogion. There's none of the stories in it are fairy tale retellings as such, but most of them and most of the chapters do certainly have influences that I grabbed hold of to use as a key for making some narrative decisions, or just to bring some consistency. It's like putting a wash over something in a picture, just to bring some tonal consistency to it. But I tried to make it always at least 2 or 3. So there's a story that's got a little bit of Red Riding Hood, but a little bit of the Ballad of Tamlin, and quite a bit of Judith Wright's poetry all in there at once. And there's another that's got a bit of the Pied Piper and a bit of Sleeping Beauty and a bit of Taily Poe. And yes, just quite a few is the answer to that question.
It sounds like it. And it's interesting that in your answer you said the tonal aspect of putting like a wash over a drawing. Because the other thing I knew about you before I knew that you had been an author or that you were a writer was that you're an artist, because you would used to come into the bookshop and cafe and then you would just do random sketches of customers, which was just so beautiful. I remember how I found you was that I was watching what you were doing. And so I'm really intrigued by how your art practice has influenced your writing. So in a physical form, as Garth has said, this is a very beautiful book. And you've done all of the drawings within it. But I'm really curious to find out more about that process of transferring those skills from, you know, art practice to writing.
I find it a very interesting question to answer because it's on several layers. Part of it is just there's certain stories I like telling, and sometimes they work best in art and sometimes they work best in words. And then there's the level of, I wrote this as part of an MPhil at the University of Queensland. So I was consciously thinking through a lot of academic questions at the same time. And the difficulty for me switching back into an academic mode was that one of the things I love about illustrating other people's books is I get to sort of swing from branch to branch of someone else's story and play in their world and ornament it and draw on the walls. And a lot of my academic urges had gone into the commentary aspect and the analysis aspect that you go through when you read a manuscript to illustrate it. And suddenly all of that energy was going into the academic side of what I was studying, and I wasn't sure what to do with the illustrations for the book. Then there's the fact that I do quite graphic line-based or silhouette illustrations. I wish I could paint well, but I am not prepared to put the time in to really learn how to do that because my heart is in the silhouettes. But writing was a chance to play with tone and texture and light. There's one or two points where I'm like, okay, what light am I going to use in this scene? And then at one point I'm like, okay, Tom Roberts' painting The Breakaway. There is a quality of light and dust in that. How can I bring it in? Especially when I can't reference the painting because that part of the story is in first person from Bettina's point of view, and she probably hasn't been to an art gallery and probably doesn't have many books of Australian art around. So trying to capture all those tones and lights in words instead of in a painting. And then at the same time, I was looking at how a few of my favorite books used artistic language to create a sense of a really robust and occasionally terrifying beauty in what was a book where terrible things happened. So Picnic at Hanging Rock, Rosalie Ham's The Dressmaker, and Sean Tan's Tales from Outer Suburbia. And it's cheating a bit with Tan because he is an illustrator, but they all used visuals on a really painterly level. With Rosalie Ham, it's much more, it could be painterly, but it's also very textile and tactile because it's about fabrics. But each part of the book starts with a description of the weight and use of fabric. And Picnic at Hanging Rock, Joan Lindsay was an artist. Everyone she knew was an artist. And the book is named after a painting and has specific paintings referred to explicitly and then just in the description. So if you walk into the NGV after having just read Picnic at Hanging Rock, you sometimes see a painting and you're like, oh, that's the scene she was describing. That makes sense now. So consciously using a lot of those illustrative approaches to texture and surface and lighting in order to capture that effect as well.
And in terms of the production of the book, did you complete the novel and then do the illustrations, or as you were writing, you were thinking, oh, I'll do an illustration here and that will go into the finished book? What was that process like?
It was an interesting process. It was quite mixed because I do tend to think, especially at the early stages of a project, I'm often thinking both visually and in prose before I nail down what I'm doing. So I have a few sketchbooks of just working through ideas, occasionally there's a scene I'm like, I know there's a girl on a bicycle and a tree and a fence, and sketching with that, which of course made it into one of the pictures. There are different ways I could draw this particular lemon tree. How do I want to do it? What style do I want to use? Do I want to use watercolor? Do I want to use pencil? But also occasionally, instead of making a list of tropes that I like in Australian Gothic fiction and working out which ones I wanted to play with, or making a list of fairy tale elements that I like, I drew a packet of, I didn't draw individual cards. I drew a picture of a pack of playing cards sprawled on a desk. And on each of them, I just drew on the bit that was visible. I'm like, okay, windmill, magpie, something creepy in the paddock, just to give this sense, just to capture for myself more of a sense of the weight of what was going on. So, and then I went to, I actually went down to Hanging Rock when I was doing some research on Picnic at Hanging Rock, and was just sort of looking at, and I was drawing through that experience. But then when it came time to do the illustrations for the book, it was much closer to the end, and I had to pick what I was going to do. So I went with silhouettes because all of the academic thought and the commentary thought and the partially telling alternate stories through the art had been diverted into the research and the writing. So it was my chance to play with quite ornamenting pictures that were more telling you the type of book it is perhaps than what happens in it. And that was a lot of fun. But not having an art director was difficult because at that point I was just writing and illustrating the book. So there's no one to help me make any decisions. So that's why everything, all the main illustrations are in a square, because I thought, oh, that will be difficult. That will force me to limit my choices and be inventive. And then I just, at some point thought, I want more pictures. I need more pictures. And I spent days just drawing birds and cutting them out and working out a sense of that bird life that I wanted to come through in the art.
Lovely. I love that notion of ornament as well, and also describing it as a pack of cards, because Kelly Link has described it as a puzzle book. And we've got Bettina, who wants to learn more about the history of her town and her family. And the whole story of Flyaway involves a story within a story within a story. So what inspired you to use this structure?
I'd started writing Flyaway, that core story, the frame, the through line, as a single story. And it wasn't the right length. It was either too long or too short for what it was trying to be, and I couldn't work out how to do it. And I had all these other fragments of stories and bits that I wanted to go in there. And someone finally said, why don't you just have people tell the stories? And I realized that whenever I do deliberately write something longer, that is the only way I ever do it, which is to have people stop and tell a story. And I enjoy that a lot personally, especially if it is, I like it if it's not obviously connected to the main plot, but then at some point it becomes relevant. So that was part of it, just working out, okay, when would people tell a story? Why? How early can I get away with putting it in? And how late can I get away with telling you what it was actually about? But I also wanted them to have almost the weight of standalone stories. So they're definitely not disconnected. They're very bound up in the plot, but I wanted them to work as objects, each with their own texture and resonances. And then there's a couple of my favorite writers do wonderful wandering plots. Diana Wynne Jones, who just starts telling a story, and about 3/4 of the way through the book, you realize that the gradual spiraling has actually been very conscious and deliberate, twisting everything up to an unavoidable conclusion. You just didn't realize that. And Kelly Link as well, in her short stories, the way at some point you just have to go, okay, I'm along for the ride. At some point, I trust the author enough to let this pay off. And I enjoyed, a few people have commented as well on the structure. I'm like, I wasn't trying to be experimental as such. It was more, these are the lengths at which units of story happen for me. Will someone let me get away with it?
And I also think in country towns, there are stories within stories, and there's also secrets. And the other trope that you're playing with is the road trip. So we do have Bettina, our young protagonist, go on a car trip with two of her friends. And I wondered, how much did you play with fairy tales and the tropes common to Australian Gothic or Australian stories?
In that sense of the road trip moving forward? I suspect that there's definitely echoes there of all those stories where people end up trapped in an inn during the plague or something and have to tell stories to each other. And that sense of people going from point A to point B and things happen along the way is an echo of some of my favorite. Like, I can't remember the name of the story. I want to say Lucky Jack. I'm not sure if that's it. The one where he goes off and works for a year and earns some money, and on his way home he keeps trading it down for less and less and less until he gets home empty-handed and quite happy because he doesn't have anything heavy to carry. So I really quite like that structure to a story. Or Puss in Boots, where you go off along the road and start lying to people until you level up. It's sort of the opposite of that story. So I certainly played with it that way. It also let me get in a few locations that I really wanted. A large part of it, though, I think was just the influence of the landscape on the story, because I've read wonderful stories which do this, but personally I have a little bit of resistance to stories which take a fairy tale and just swap the elements out one for Australian equivalents. Okay, lizards get changed into coachmen. Okay, we'll make it wombats. Which is fine. It can be great and funny, but I love the feeling of what happens when you actually put a story into a landscape and feel it change, and its bones change shape, and it grows in ways that it maybe shouldn't, and which seems like such a fairy tale thing to happen. Like, fairy tales are all about things in the wrong place and growing out of control, and having them move through that landscape searching for it was a natural outcome, I suspect, of putting it out in the bush, because if all you are capable of seeing are units of houses and civilization, then all that exists between them is trees. But if you are out there and you are prepared to look into the trees, then there are just worlds and stories that roll through that. But at the same time, you don't usually do it on foot these days.
Yeah, it's lovely. So one of the stories that's really stayed with me is Gwenda's story, and it's the story of a school that gets taken over by the lantern bush.
Yes.
And you've got this lovely line where Woodwild gave up on science. And through the whole book, even from what you read at the beginning, right through, there's a really strong environmental theme to it. And there's this kind of underlying presence of mining as well. So how you begin it and end it is this notion of what's going to happen to the environment. Can you talk a little bit about that and the strong environmental themes that you've addressed in Flyaway?
Sure. So it certainly wasn't a case of consciously wanting to write an environmental fable. Not that there's anything wrong with that. That was a fairly natural outcome of playing with those elements that I talked about previously in that landscape, because fairy tales are full of things changing and are full of things growing out of control. Hair, vines, rose bushes, Alice in Wonderland, all of that. And once you try to look for any echo of that in the Australian landscape, it just seems so obvious that introduced species were the equivalent of that. And I think even if I hadn't gone for echoes of introduced species, it would have been unavoidable. And as someone who likes fairy tales and who likes wonderful tales but grew up out west, there are so many almost fairy tale feeling stories of the prickly pear rendering millions of acres unusable and getting underneath floorboards and pushing those, just all of those stories. And then when the cactus blastus moth was brought out, farmers in the 20s breaking into the DPI to steal the eggs before they were released because they couldn't wait 1 week more. And I certainly obviously brought very strong elements of that in, but also of lantana and of how destructive it is, but how beautiful, really how beautiful it is when you're driving through somewhere and suddenly there's these stars of color, and how problematic it is, but it is so lovely at the same time, and that both those things can coexist, that beauty can be horrible but still beautiful. So that definitely came through. The mines were partly because I did want to set this story not specifically in the time that I was growing up out west, but in a time that felt like that. And that perhaps was, although except for one or two things, it could almost be now because phone reception still isn't great out there. But just in a particular time that I remembered, and I liked the potential of the slightly elegiac, like here are things that happen, terrible, wonderful things happen. And those stories happened because stories were overriding previous stories and people had come in and done terrible things to people before them. But now the next story is going to get overwritten by the mines. And of course now the mines are going out of business, and that story is getting overwritten by plants again. And there's this wonderful recursion, wonderful's the wrong word, but which let me pull back to that, and that sense of things lying over the top and underneath other stories, and yeah, being overwritten but never quite being erased.
And that leads me into your author's note at the end, where you also tried to acknowledge the bloody history of Australia. And can I ask you about that, and the duty that you felt to an Aboriginal history on the land that we live on?
So that was a very strong duty that I felt, complicated by many things, including stories that are not mine to tell, and hurt that I don't want to amplify. But of course you can amplify hurt by getting things wrong, but also by not mentioning things at all. And by the fact, which I think is where I landed on with this story, that growing up where I did, among the people I did, we just didn't, and especially as a child, we just didn't get told the story is the right way. We didn't really know what had happened. Or vaguely aware, yes, bad things happened, but not now, but not by the people. And all our neighbours are, second or third generation, so they weren't here then, and there's nobody left in the area, so it's all in the past. And then at some point going, oh no, I think the Yemen or Imani people are still around. No one told us that. No one told us that growing up. We didn't. Yeah, and that sense of people being aware that terrible things have been done, and often by family members or the families of friends, but not wanting to talk about it. But all of the terrible things that come from not talking about the stories, I did want to bring up in Flyaway and acknowledge. And although the main characters are so preoccupied with their own stories and the stories of their generation, to leave the book knowing that there are other histories there that have happened, but that they have not yet addressed, and also perhaps haven't learned yet. So I fully accept I may have got things wrong or not dealt with it well, but I didn't want to not acknowledge it. And that's also why in the acknowledgements I wanted to list a number of authors who absolutely write amazing books of the landscape, but who are Indigenous, First Nations authors who are telling all of the stories that I didn't know about growing up.
I think you did it so well, in my opinion. And there's also a lovely line, I think it's at the beginning, about, what are the stories that are part of this land? So, yeah, well done. And talking about books, what are the books that influenced you growing up? What sustains you?
The earliest books that I really remember being read and then reading are, and these all had an influence in some respect, Little Red Riding Hood, Laura Ingalls Wilder's books, which are definitely a different experience to what I imagine they are for American readers. If you read them while growing up in the Australian bush and people being chased by, mountain lions through the trees, and then you have to go out and bring the cow home from through the outback scrub, and there are probably no large black cats leaping from branch to branch to attack you, but there are stories of large black cats. So who knows? It was deeply terrifying. Hound of the Baskervilles scarred me. Love it. Scarred me. I am much, much better with night in the city than I am in the country still, even in Australia, where nothing will get me. I know this. That's my dad's fault as well. Chronicles of Narnia, Chronicles of Prydain, Lord of the Rings. My father is listening to this, used to pick up hitchhikers, put them in the back of a station wagon with 2 months' groceries and drive them out to the middle of nowhere, which I'm sure was a deeply terrifying experience for them. And then they'd stay with us for 2 or 3 weeks, and it was great. And there was a Welsh potter and hang glider. And I remember that he was the person who told me about Lord of the Rings. But then there were all of the, Henry Lawson, Banjo Patterson, many of which my father drilled me in until I knew off by heart, and Gary Crew, Colin Teeley, all the Ash Wednesday bushfire stories, although I may have disrespected them a little bit at the beginning, very influential. And then just everything, linguistics, poetry, Judith Wright and Robert Frost, who both, to varying extents, the way they approach, I think the utterly romantic pragmatism with which they approach the environment and landscape. I loved that sense of, you know, losing yourself in the trees, but also them only being trees, or are they? And that line from Judith Wright, lean, clean, hungry country full of old stories that go walking in my sleep.
Oh,
So
lovely.
All of that steeped over a period of years.
And that's something else we share, Kathleen, is that my father, who's a cane farmer in far north Queensland, he also picked up hitchhikers, and he would bring them home as well. And it was certainly, this was in the early 70s, and it was a way for, it's a really interesting burst of ideas where you see that there's a world out there where you're a young girl on an isolated farm, and then there's other world of people out there. And I think it's
people from Holland and people in the Netherlands and people from Wales and people who just randomly show up, to the point that neighbours used to pick up people in broken down vans travelling out west and just send them to our place.
So we've got, with Flyaway, we've got this amazing setting, all of the tropes, all of the ideas, but then there's all these wonderful characters as well. So we can't forget how great these characters are and what a strong character-driven story it is. So I want to ask you about Bettina, our young protagonist, who's on this journey to uncover what's happened to her father and to her brothers. Why this word monsters has been painted on her family's fence, and her mother. I just want to ask you about that relationship between Bettina and her mother, Merida.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for saying that about the characters, because I know it's not a very character-forward story, but I really like the characters there, and I was trying to be quite subtle with it. So thank you, great, that worked. One of the things with Bettina and her mother, I have to say, is that I have a very good relationship with my parents. They're wonderful parents. I had an amazing childhood. My father was also, as well as being a grazier, in the army, and he tried to teach us a lot of marching songs, of which I now know the first 2 words, which, as far as I know, then go on to say, "Mark, I'm trying to raise ladies." And there was always that aspect of, which I really appreciate. Mother, you are listening, I know. So I really appreciate, I think, there's a lot of criticism cast at being raised to be ladies, or sitting properly and all of that today, which is fair. Be authentic, everything. It is great, but they are quite difficult skills to learn later in life, and they're incredibly useful for weaponizing, I have to say, like both for negotiating difficult situations, but also you can use them in certain ways in the world. And having been a lawyer and having been exposed to that in the country, this is how you host something. This is, have to make sure you talk to everyone, make sure everyone's got a plate of food, and then being able to bring that into a legal meeting and be able to move around a room in that way. And I always admire people who have those sorts of skills. Garth is definitely one of them, actually. When I watch Garth in action at a convention, I'm like, oh, that way, that there's a certain skill set that I find fascinating, and I'm always trying to pick up aspects of, but it can definitely be weaponized for evil as well as for good. And a huge part of the fun of writing this story was picking up on things that I loved, places I loved, people I loved, and just going, but what if they were evil? and not that it was necessarily always evil, but that sense of it being problematic. That all of these things are useful when you are using them to smooth the course of human affairs honestly. But being proper, being correct can be used to control people, either by forcing them to be that way or by manipulating them. And I just wanted to play with both the beauty and the dangers of that, because it is something I appreciate having had growing up, but you also see the nasty side of it sometimes. But also that sense of 2 people who, even though one is much older adult and one is a young woman, she's technically, she's 19, but she's not a child. But 2 people at very different stages in their life, still working out and negotiating together what it is to be human. And that is always a very interesting question, I find, in books. It's something I love. People just working out what it means to be human and who you are in the world. It's something I love about murder mysteries, because especially the Golden Age ones, which are all about exactly how you phrase things in order to work with people. And I think of them sometimes as tragedies of manners rather than comedies of manners. But also I'm watching on iView, if no one knows, the new Mallory Towers series based on the Enid Blyton novels, which are about becoming a certain sort of person in the world. And it's always such an interesting question when people consciously address it. So I wanted to play with that. And then with little echoes of that in her friends, Trish and Gary, and more so I think in Gary, who has a very different family life to the extent it's hinted at, but still has to work out to what extent he is just going to be a Damson and to what extent he understands what that means.
And because I love those relationships between Bettina, Trish and Gary as well, because in some ways it is like almost like a young adult teenage novel as well, where they're, you know, Trish has left, Gary is there, is he really who you think he is Bettina, like it touches on so many of the aspects of what it's like to be a teenager in a country town. So,
and I find that a very interesting place to be a teenager, because in large towns with high schools and everyone goes through to year 12, everyone's still a teenager until a couple of years into uni. But a lot of my schoolmates left school at the end of year 10. And even when I went to boarding school for 11 and 12, there was a guy who was like, you know, he's going to be school captain and everything else. And then he just left because he got a job doing what he wanted to do way out west on a property a couple months before he finished high school. And people who just go out and get, like, they know what they want to do. And whether it's an apprenticeship or they're taking over some aspect of the family business, there's a very different sense of when you stop, I think, being a child. But you're still so young.
So my final question before we go to questions from the audience, and it was something that you mentioned that you have caught up with Garth at conventions. The other thing I know about you, Kathleen, is that you travel a huge amount, that you're often at conferences, conventions, meeting with other authors and publishers overseas, everywhere, here, there. What has COVID meant for you?
You might have noticed this, or you might not have noticed this. I really like talking to people about books. It's been difficult. No, COVID, like, when I am home, I am very much home. So I'm used to being in the house, drawing and writing. But I also just really like hanging out with people, talking about books. And it has been wonderful the ways that it's opened up to be able to do that easily without horrific jet lag. Although one night I was sitting up late at night in the high back chair working, and it was summer, so it was just a bit hot and uncomfortable, and suddenly I was seized by this enormous nostalgia for long haul flights. I think largely the biggest difficulty for me, because I love traveling and looking at new places and seeing beauty, but I can do that here as well. The biggest difficulty has honestly been that I never take weekends, because I always take 1 or 2 months, which are still working and sleeping on people's spare beds or on their sofas and emotionally blackmailing people who casually say, oh, if you're ever in Perth, Scotland, feel free to stay. I'm like, really? How's Friday? Is that I kind of did that instead of taking weekends, and now I have to work out how to go along without these sort of timing stops in my ear and just take timing stops in the week. And also a little bit, I really like long distance public transportation. Planes, up to a certain point, I do have a cutoff, but trains and buses, and I always have a book of poetry because I can't concentrate on anything long and just stare out the window and look at the trees. It's really nice. I miss it.
That is probably the most bizarre thing I've ever heard anybody say, that they love long distance public transport. Oh my God, Kathleen,
like being in an Agatha Christie novel. It's like being in an Agatha Christie novel.
Oh no. And you know how big Queensland is. You can get on a bus for 2 days and you've only got up halfway.
Well, the bits with trees in it are nice. The bits without trees in it are a bit weird.
So if there's any questions from the audience, but I also want to know if we've got questions from the audience, but also what are you working on now? What's keeping you going?
Well, I'm doing all sorts of art, including I've just recently finished illustrations for Angela Slater's next collection, which is The Tallow Wife, and I am currently looking off the side at my drawing board where I have art in progress for a book of fairy tales by Juliette Marillier, which I need to get finished. But I also have another tiny little book coming out in just a couple of months from Brisbane Small Press, Brainjar Press, which is not quite poetry, but not poetry. It is basically the strings of descriptions of things that I've seen on various train journeys. So if people read Flyaway and really like the sentences but can take or leave narrative, then that is coming out, and it's all just sentences with no narrative apart from getting from point A to point B. But just, it's much more of a sketchbook than poems. It's a process of sorting through a way to see particular landscapes as I go through them. And I am working on a PhD at the University of Queensland now, and as part of that I'm working on a very large, sprawling mythic fantasy project with a lot of Sir Orfeo and a little bit of Robin Hood in it. But it's really the counterpart to Flyaway, because Flyaway is largely what happens when you look at the Australian landscape through too many fairy tales. And the other project is largely what happens when the only impression you have ever got of England is by reading too many fairy tales while sitting in Western Queensland.
Well, I'm looking forward to reading that. That sounds amazing.
Thank you.
So Emma-Kate, do we have any questions?
Yes, we do. We've got several questions. I'm sorry to the people who already mentioned this in the chat, but I'm sorry to the people whose questions have already been asked by Fiona. But they have sent me a few more. So let's start with, Claire has said, are there any particular lessons from writing that you've now been able to apply to your visual art?
Oh, very interesting question.
That's a good one.
I think I have become more conscious of deliberately approaching certain structural elements of stories. And I think now in my visual art, I'm more often going, okay, so this is an illustration for a very specific story. It has to be true to the script, but I can enliven it by just bringing in an emotional through line from another story that I happen to love. So that has certainly come through in the visual art. And, excuse me, just, I think that being conscious of what I'm doing, really taking the time, especially as I had to go through all the editing processes, to stop and go, what am I doing and why was I doing it? And I think that's just a very good habit to get into. And also at this end of the process, actually being put on the spot a lot and being told, well, you clearly did this thing, how and why, and what would you do differently, or how would you repeat it? And that is something I'm now trying to do at the end of art projects. Actually sit down and go, what did I like about this? What ideas did I get along the way that I didn't get a chance to explore in this, but I could do next? What did I learn not to do next time?
Karen would like to know what the most significant thing you have learned about yourself is through writing this novel.
I learned about myself. I think it is, this is going to sound either far less profound or far more profound than I intended it to be, how little effort it is necessary to be at all self-critical. Like, I think someone said this was a very critical view, the Flyaway was a very critical view of something, and I was like, I didn't think it was that revolutionary a view as an Australian to say sometimes introduced species cause just a little bit of havoc. But just that sense of like, it doesn't hurt to be self-reflective occasionally, or to go, there are things that I loved about my family and how I grow up, but it does not hurt to stop and go, could this be taken too far? And also, incidentally, have I ever done that? Have I ever taken this too far? And it doesn't hurt. It doesn't unmake your personality to do that. So I think that was a large part of it. On a lighter note, part of the process of trying to get a real sense of beauty in this was to try to make sure that I went back and edited descriptions of things that would traditionally be, and very easily, as a cliche, just write as ugly things, and at least try and put a few words in there that made it beautiful, whether it was a scrap heap or a vehicle, just to put a line or two in there that was honoring the surface of things. But I discovered how much fun it is doing a sort of industrial fabulism is the word I've been using. It's not the right word, mechanical fabulism, that sense of, even though something might be rusting and mechanical and polluting and everything else, you can still find aspects of it lovely, even if it's just the shadow that it casts.
Beautiful.
It's beautiful. Maria would like to know how long this story idea had been simmering before you decided to write.
it's possibly a little the other way around. I had an idea. I had a very clear image in my head of something that happened late in the story. And I sat down and relatively quickly wrote a sketch of that central through line. It didn't quite work. And then I sat on it for ages while the other bits of stories brewed, and while I guess it put out tendrils and started growing. And I sat on it for that basic concept for a few years. And then I sat down and I realized I had all these elements that I could pull, that were the same story, that were the same people, that were families, and I could pull those together. So a number of years with very busy periods of writing at each end of it. Sometimes I find I just have to wait until I work out the thing that's missing, or the fact that this story looks like a full short story, but it actually needs to have another story to lean up against, and then they can support each other.
Garth, who's now on mute, has asked if the book with the orange binding on the shelf behind your right shoulder is a PG Wodehouse title, Kathleen.
Horizontal or vertical, Garth? So I can see two orange ones. There's Q's Legacy, which is a fabulous book of Helene Hunt writing about how she came to write 1984. Not 1984. Charing Cross Road, 84 Charing Cross Road. Similar numbers. The other one is Cameos of Crime, which is the memoirs of a Queensland policeman who came over from Ireland in 1880. And it is also fascinating. There is probably Wodehouse in the house, but might be another one. I'm not sure. There's some orange Connie Willis's as well.
So I think we've got time for one last question, and a few people have asked variations of it, so I should definitely ask this one. They would like to know about your writing process, any special writing rituals that you've had, and if you could elaborate a little bit as well. People are still asking about how your art has informed your writing process. So if you could talk a bit more about that.
I try to do something writing or art related most days, and there are stages I go through when I do it every day. So even if it's just jotting bits down, because I figure even if I am writing 100 words of nothing, or 100 words of the story that I tell myself to wind down at the end of the day, or even if I'm just drawing a smiley face every day, at some point it's like doing scales on the piano or drills at something else. You keep in practice, and then when you have an idea that you want to write, the sentences come out more easily. But also after a while you get really, really sick of drawing smiley faces, and there's this sense of creative frustration that builds up. So that is part of it. When I am working on a specific project and it's finally got some traction, or even when I'm needing it to get some traction, then I'll try and do an hour every day. I always go, oh, I want to go away and write for 10 hours a day, but I'm not fit generally, but also you sort of need a degree of creative fitness, I sometimes think, to do that. And if I'm doing an hour a day, then by the time it finally gets enough momentum that I'm like, right, now I'm going to write for 24 hours without stopping, I've actually built up the training almost that I need to do that. So that's a large part of it, but the same with illustration. So they inform each other that way. And with that being more conscious of it, something I have been doing this year, because I was teaching a creativity course at the university, was keeping an observation journal quite deliberately, one page of which is just things I'd seen, heard, done, and a picture from the day, which is, it's fun. Even if you're being very banal, it still gives a really lovely picture of the day. And the other one, I'll just do various creative exercises, whether it's that breaking down a project that I've finished to see what I think about it in retrospect, or playing with an approach to metaphor that I want to do and writing that out. Or there's a story that I heard that I love and I want to see, if I take, like, I just went and saw this movie, what happens if you change an element and that element and the other element and switch the beginning and end around, and just watching to see at what point it turns into an idea that catches my attention. And the same thing happens with drawing. Even though when I'm writing, I am usually seeing things, sometimes words just go together, but you always have to go back and edit them carefully. I'm usually seeing something quite visually in my head and then trying to describe it. When I'm illustrating, I'm rarely seeing the thing in my head. The visualization is happening much more where the pen hits the paper. So I'm drawing a thing, but I'm waiting to see what lines come out and then how to control them and bring them under control. And I think just being much more aware of that process and what I'm doing and how I'm using it is a big part of how the two influence each other. And even like running through things like what order you put the events in a story is then a lot of fun. You go, well, am I showing events in the right order in this picture? Should I draw Jack B. Nimble jumping over the lamp of the candlestick, or should I draw him getting ready to go, or should I draw him like missing his footing and tumbling off on the other side? They're all very different approaches to a story. What metaphors can I put into a picture of Jack jumping over the candlestick? Like, could I bring in some Little Red Riding Hood, and then you get like wolfish fur effects in the flames, or the shadows doing something creative, which is the same thing that I do with metaphors and with stories. And I'm only up to February, but on my blog, which is tanordell.wordpress.com, I have been starting to put up some of those pages from the observation journal just to show how I work through those and bounce back and forth between illustration and writing. So yeah, it's definitely, thank you for asking those questions, because it is something that it is a lot of fun to play with.
Lovely, thank you so much. I've actually just been sent the link to your observation journal, so I'm going to copy it and paste it for everybody here. Thank you so much, Shirley, for sending that through.
Thank you, Shirley.
Sent it to everybody here. And now, unfortunately, we've run out of time for the evening. I'm sure that we could continue chatting all evening. I certainly would love to. It's been an absolutely fantastic discussion. Thank you so much, Kathleen, and thank you, Fiona. And thank you, Garth, also, for the fantastic introduction. And so, unless either of you have any final comments, I will be taking everybody off mute so that they can join me now in thanking you both.
I just want to really congratulate Kathleen for doing such a wonderful job of Flyaway. Well done, Kathleen.
Thank you so much, Fiona. I really appreciate it. And you and Avid Reader have meant so much to me as formative, both as a reader and as a writer. So I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
And thank you so much, Garth. It was just delightful to have you introducing the book and reading it.
Thank you. Okay, everybody is coming off mute now so that you can join me. Here we go. Everybody's off mute.
Yay, well done.
Thank you.
Yay, well done.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Emma Kate. That was great.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
See ya.
Congratulations again.
Thank you, everybody. Well done, Kathleen.
Thank you.
Kathleen. Well done.
Congratulations.
Hello, everybody.
Bye.